fewer storms is what is the big driver for more droughts going forward. So you'll get fewer storms in the little window that California has. And if you miss a couple of those, then you're in a drought, and that's going to happen more often.
Flipping the table.
Welcome to Season 3 of Flipping the Table. We begin with writer Tom Philpott. I have respected Tom's voice for many years. I first heard it when he wrote for Grist, the online nonprofit magazine in the 2000s. He did a great job revealing the shadow side of agriculture and the growing movement to transform it. Part of Tom's success is that he spent many years farming in North Carolina, so he knows the realities of agriculture. Since 2011, Tom has been the food and agriculture correspondent for Mother Jones. His writing is hard-hitting, dramatic, and incisive. Last summer, he published Perilous Bounty, the looming collapse of American farming and how we can prevent it. This is a fascinating and chilling book. It is focused on soil degradation in the Midwest's Corn Belt and the overdraft of water from ancient aquifers in California. There is a fact-filled focus on California's Great Central Valley. That valley and the Corn Belt are also the two primary sources of the nation's food supply. Perilous Bounty ends with hope and points to a better future where a regenerative and more regionally oriented food supply blooms. In this third season of Flipping the Table, I will be diving deep into California's challenges and the efforts of my organization, Roots of Change, to address them. At Roots of Change, we aim to be a catalyst for transformation of food and farming, to model for our allies around the nation who are seeking a better approach to feeding our people. Roots of Change does nothing without large alliances of like-minded leaders and their organization. So, this season, we'll highlight many incredible nonprofits, community-based organizations, and government agencies working to improve food and farming. Roots of Change is working on a number of important policy initiatives and projects that are scaling the changes we seek. And I'm excited to be sharing our work and the folks involved all season long. I believe my conversation with Tom Philpott sets the stage in a compelling way. Thanks for listening. Glad to have you.
So good to be here, Michael.
Yeah. So you're back in North Carolina. I'm talking to you from California, so everyone's going to have to bear with us on this cell phone thing. But I just wanted to say that your book, Perilous Bounty, paints an amazingly harrowing picture of California agriculture. And I really do see this overarching warning about water shortages and the impact of global warming. And particularly in the Central Valley, I think we'll focus a lot on that. But you talk about Salinas and the Pajaro Valleys. You talk about the Imperial Valley in the book. I mean, it's really comprehensive and packed full of facts and figures. But before we get into the real, a breakdown of the challenge, I'd love if you would share your description of the Central Valley, kind of pre-European agriculture, because I found it extremely compelling and heartrending in a certain way.
Yeah, I had the same experience sort of learning about the history, which I did after I had been through it multiple times, sort of the modern day Central Valley, which is sort of like this, quasi-desert, and, except for places that are irrigated, and you get this green irrigation. But in between the irrigation now, the whole damn thing in the summer is pretty much a desert. And what I found in researching the book is that, and if you think about it, it's not that surprising, because there is this incredible mountain range along the sort of eastern spine of the Central Valley. And because it gets this amazing snowpack, obviously there are, a lot of that water melts every year and you get these incredible rivers. And we all know that. But in our lifetimes, those rivers have always been quite well dammed, and every drop in them pretty much spoken for sometimes oversubscribed. But before really before U.S. settlement, there was actually very little development of that water. So this is through the centuries of Spanish rule, the Spanish didn't really do much development of the water at all in the Central Valley. Neither did Mexico when it controlled the area. And so what you got was these, big, mighty, wild rivers, most of which, would flow through the delta into the sea. But some of them on the southern end would flow, as I think a lot of people know this, into a couple of huge lakes. The biggest one being Lake Tulare, and these were, just so even in the summer, in these riparian areas, which were vast, cut through the valley at many points, incredibly biodiverse. Lots and lots of water, forests, incredible amounts of wildlife. And then something else is just, so, we all know and can sort of feel in our bones, the sort of missing lake in the Tulare region. But what I didn't know before the research was just how much wetlands there were. There were, hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands in the area, almost 100% of which have been drained. And so you're talking about an area that actually has very similar rainfall patterns to now, where you get very little rainfall outside the winter months, and not that much in the winter months either. But at this time, there was loads and loads and loads of water in the Central Valley, incredible amounts of wildlife, lots and lots of people living there, indigenous tribes and various different areas of the valley. And really that situation, for the most part, survives until, a decade or two into U.S. settlement, which I found to be really interesting. Like in Mexico and under the Spanish, most of the development was happening at the coast. That was where you had the missions and the real attempts to sort of impose, the sort of these Western ideas. And the Central Valley was fairly outside of that process until the United States showed up.
Yeah. It's a very. I remember. I read the autobiography of Sherman, General Sherman, who was out here in the early part, 30 years before the Civil War. And he talked about traveling in that book, what it was like in the Central Valley. And then when I read your book, I was like, wow, it just reminded me of the incredible beauty that must have been there. The Valley does still have beauty. I mean, particularly this time of year, I was talking to some farmers in the last few days, and it's a bloom again, and there's a beauty in that. But the monocultures have changed the type of beauty and the periods of beauty, and obviously the ecological quality that is there. And what you said about the wetlands, those were the great sources of the aquifers, were they not?
Yes, they were. They were the sort of way that a lot of the water percolated downward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's the segue. Let's really give our listeners a picture of the challenge, the major central huge challenge that California agriculture faces in the Central Valley, but really in all the valleys that are producing most of the food.
Yeah, so I think in the Central Valley specifically, I think what you have is a situation where, we've got, through the 20th century, you get this amazing process of, finally big government entities coming in, the state, the U.S. federal government coming in, and making this dream that had really been around since pretty early in statehood, U.S. statehood, of harnessing the resources of that snowmelt and taking those resources and really making them available for the valley. And, when you do that, and so you have that incredible annual resource of runoff, and then you're able, you've got the infrastructure in place to harness it. And then you've got this secondary resource that you just mentioned, the aquifers. If you've got those two sort of assets, and then you add to that this Mediterranean climate. And if anyone out there listening has ever farmed or gardened in the Northeast, for example, or in the Southeast,
where you farmed for many years,
yeah, where I farmed for many years in the Southeast and Western North Carolina, one thing you'll note is that we get a lot of rain out this way, and when you get a lot of rain, you don't worry about irrigation too much, but there's lots and lots of problems that comes with it. Your fruits and vegetables get pounded in the summer. It gives rise to lots of insect life, things like mold. And so these are the challenges that you get when you have too much water. But when you farm in an area where there's very, very little rainfall in the summer, and you can push a button and get drip irrigation where and when you need it, it's a pretty dreamy scenario for growing food. So, in that sense, it's really no mistake or no coincidence or surprise that the Central Valley has become this agricultural behemoth over the years. But what I think has happened is that the valley's agriculture has gotten so big and so ravenous for water, I think driven by this, large, expansive Mediterranean climate, that it has essentially outstripped the resources that are available. And so you get something like the annual snowmelt, and it's like, your income. It's like what you want to be living on. And then you've got the aquifer, and that's your sort of retirement account. You don't want to be tapping into it. But I think what's happened is it's just gotten so easy until pretty recently to tap into that sort of retirement account, that as the income has dwindled, and I know I'm making an extended metaphor here, but
yeah, but no, we get it. Yeah, it's good.
As the snow melt has, as we've seen, and I document in the book, over the past 20 or 30 years, there's a marketed downward trend in this, let's say, the 5-year average of the snowpack that comes into the area. So what you're getting is an industry that has gotten rather used to being able to, drop its taps into the water, into the aquifer, and tap into the aquifer and pump water out at will. And so what you're getting here is until SGMA, and I know your audience knows what that is, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. There was basically no regulation on restrictions on groundwater pumping. And so agriculture really came to rely on it as something that's tapped every year, something that is obviously tapped in drought years, and it's also tapped in non-drought years, and never refilled in non-drought years. And so what you get is a path toward, essentially being on a race to the bottom of the aquifer, and a kind of arms race about wells, who can build the deepest well, who can invest the most in wells. And it costs more, when you're in an arms race like that, it totally favors larger operations and leads to, consolidation, bigger and bigger farms. It also means that farms that have a lot of or entities with a lot of investment money, like insurance companies, can come in, and they've got the deep enough pocket to invest in those wells and ensure that they have access to water, even if their neighbor can't afford to go as deep into the aquifer. And that, I think, is the major challenge. And I think SGMA is a potential solution to it, but there is no sort of adhering to SGMA and maintaining a decent aquifer into the future without cutting way back on agriculture in the area. And I think that's got profound implications for landowners in the area, for farm workers in the area, and also for eaters in the United States who rely on the region for fruits and vegetables.
Well, this is good. That was a huge, really well done job of kind of an overview of the challenge. I want to dig in deeper on a few of the things that you brought up in that. One is the impact of climate change. I mean, some of the statistics I've seen them in other areas, but the amount, the precipitous decline in snowpack is, no one could have predicted it, right? 20 years ago. Well, the scientists did, but people in agriculture, people like me, weren't thinking about that 20 years ago. Now it's undeniable. It's like 35% drop over the last 10 years in terms of averages, correct?
Yeah, and if you look at the models, and I think you're referring to this in the book, the climate models and research coming out of places like UCLA are suggesting that major declines still yet to come. Like, essentially by something like 2080 on a sort of greenhouse gas emissions path that we're on now, without major cuts, you could be looking at where the normal year is essentially no snowpack, which is just a mind-boggling thing to think about.
Yes, it is, because I'm a backpacker and I've spent most summers going into the Sierra, and I have seen the change over the last 20 years in terms of what the trees look like and how much water is available. So it is devastating to think about that potentiality. And also temperatures are rising, right? So that has evapotranspiration increases, and you have all kinds of, you need more water. Those were things that came out very clearly. And the other thing that I almost felt like was a character in the book was the drought of 2011 to 17. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was. I'm preaching to the choir in California, but it was quite a remarkable event where you had several years of essentially, minimal or no snowpack, which translated to minimal or no water distributed to farmers. You had some leftover water that would get traded around and things like that, but very little new water entering the system for a couple of years. And one of the things that was really jaw-dropping to watch was the degree to which in that period the output from the Central Valley did not fall very much. It did fall. There was some land put into, land that went fallow for a year or two. But for the most part, this giant machine just kept churning out food. And of course, it did so with groundwater, with water sucked from the aquifer. But there's a scene in the book. I visited California, I believe it was 2014, so right in the middle of the drought. And I go down to the San Joaquin Valley, actually, in Tulare County, a little town called Alpa. And I was in this area, in this township, where the people in the town, who are largely almost 100% Latinos, mostly farm worker families, were, because of the sort of water use laws from the drought, told they couldn't water their lawns. They couldn't, they would have a couple of fruit trees in the yard. You can't water those. We're in a drought. We all have to sacrifice. And then, on top of that, they had two wells in the town, and both of them were, and these were supplying water to people's taps, and both of them were over the limit for arsenic. And arsenic is a naturally occurring chemical, but as you get deeper and deeper into the aquifer, it gets more and more concentrated. And they were so far down into the aquifer that they were over the EPA limit for arsenic concentration. So these families were told, you can't water your trees, you can't water your lawns. Also, you can't drink the water because it's poisonous. And so they're, spending a substantial amount of their income buying bottled water to have safe drinking water. And then, being taken right outside the town. Just like literally at the town line by the gentleman who was managing their water system to this pistachio orchard that was going in. And, as far as the eye could see in a couple of directions, these pistachio saplings and workers laying down drip line, and you could see that there's well being put in at a certain point. So right outside the city, the town, I should say, water is being treated like this completely freely available. Don't worry about it. Invest millions of dollars in this pistachio orchard to put this stand of pistachio trees in. While inside the town, you can't drink the water; it's poisonous, and you can't water your little peach tree.
Right.
It was quite something.
What a contrast, huh? Yeah.
And blistering hot, I should add. And I was living in Texas at that time, so I knew from hot. But it was like 100 degrees. I mean, it was July. It was quite something.
Hi, this is Michael. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Flipping the Table, sponsored by Roots of Change. I love sharing the compelling people and projects that are creating a better food and farming future. A future in sync with and healing of nature. A future good for rural communities. And one supportive of our food chain workers from farm and ranch to table. And certainly one that is healthier for our bodies. I need your support to keep Roots of Change vital and to keep this podcast alive. So please, go to our website, rootsofchange.org. That is rootsofchange.org, and hit the donate button. Your generous support will help me, our team, and allies to build a better future for our kids, communities, and for you. There is much to do, and every dollar you donate helps the cause. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show. And, you brought up arsenic. I have been obviously down there in that period too, and actually toured with one of the most thoughtful farmers I know, large scale farmer down there, Stuart Wolf, who was showing me the impact on the trees from the salt. So it's not just arsenic; there's salt. The deeper you go, the more salt, and so it's humans being impacted, and obviously that is the most critical element. But the future of agriculture is being impacted as well by the salt that's impacting the trees.
Yeah, and in fact, in a lot of that region, including where I was, almonds are already out of the question because almonds are more salt sensitive than pistachios, and so you go to the most salt sensitive lucrative crop you can get, pistachios, and when the pistachios because pistachios also, all plants have a threshold for how much salt they can tolerate. And you'll reach that for pistachios someday. And then what's next?
Yeah, that's right. Well, so this is, I think people get the challenge here. Less water, more challenges with the water the deeper you go, and increasing heat. But I'm going to throw a little curveball here because one of the things that really struck me about the book that was also interesting was the history of flooding. So we're in the middle of this discussion about the lack of water, but you have a whole section in there about the history of flooding in the valley. I think you should just share this. And I want to hear from you if you think, what are the probabilities of something like that again?
Yeah. So that was another major jaw dropper as I was researching the book was that, the way California weather works and the way that it interacts with climate is that California weather originates deep in the South Pacific. And there's obviously, as the water gets warmer, as the atmosphere warms up, you get more evaporation, and that brings more energy and water into the system, into these atmospheric rivers. And so what it ends up seeming to mean is that you get fewer but significantly more fierce winter storms, or storms in general. And so the storms, because of a high pressure ridge that sits around the California coast for the non-winter months, most of those storms get, knocked up to the Pacific Northwest, which is why they have such a rainy climate up there, and down into southern Mexico. And that ridge in normal years, although it doesn't always happen.
We're having it right now. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the drivers of drought is you get a resilient ridge that blocks during the winter. And so the fewer storms is what is the big driver for more droughts going forward. So you get fewer storms in the little window that California has. And if you miss a couple of those, then you're in a drought, and that's going to happen more often. Mm-hmm. But the fiercer storms part is also super important, and that makes a big flood, a flood that's bigger than any of us have experienced in our lifetime. I'm going to quote a paper by a researcher at UCLA named Daniel Swain, mm-hmm. And what they concluded is more likely than not in the next, I think, 30 years was the time frame. And so that puts us over 50%, mm-hmm. To answer your question, mm-hmm. As precisely as I can. But what is fascinating is that when you look at the fossil record, and there are paleoclimatologists, scientists who specialize in doing this, when you look at the fossil climate record and weather record of California by examining things like sediment around streams, mostly in the Bay Delta, but in other places, there's these sediments that you can sort of go back, sort of like analogous to tree rings, and get an idea of past events. And people have been doing this for about 20 or 30 years now. And what they found was that there had been about 5 or 6 giant storms that have hit California and had huge impacts on what we now call the Central Valley over the past about 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. And so the sort of background record is this is something that happens every 100 to 200 years. Mm-hmm. And, you ask yourself, California becomes a state, in the, late 1850s or something like that. Mm-hmm. Have we seen one? Have we had one like that? Did the Spanish report one? Well, it turns out that there is one in recorded history, and that is, maybe some of your listeners will know about it, the Great Flood of 1861-62. Mm-hmm. And this is a couple of years after statehood. The gold rush is starting to taper off, but San Francisco is getting a pretty big population. And, one fine day in December, it begins to rain, and it just doesn't stop. And there's already a snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, and rain hits it. And so you get this, nonstop deluge, and then you get snow melt, and it all goes cascading into the Central Valley. And what you get is the entire Central Valley under something like 20 feet of water. Mm-hmm. And so it was this incredibly cataclysmic event. It spared San Francisco. When it rains for 50 days or straight or whatever, I don't know if people in San Francisco would say they were spared, but they didn't get flooded away. Sacramento was flooded badly. The entire Central Valley was under lots of water. And at that time, it's interesting, agriculture was mostly Mexican nationals who had gotten U.S. statehood in the deal that made California a state. They had gotten U.S. citizenship in that deal. And they were, basically ranchers raising cattle for the leather market. And there was some, transition into beef for the California's urban centers. And you had a lot of white settlers, Americans in California really wanting that land, wanting to get their hands on it because they thought, there's money to be, growing food for these cities. And so this flood comes in and completely wipes out these ranches, just clears them out, kills hundreds of thousands of cattle. The ranchers go belly up, and they ended up, basically selling the land at pennies on the dollar to the settlers, and it completely transforms California agriculture. And as it comes back, it comes back more. There wasn't a lot of money to restock cattle, so it comes back as stuff like wheat and crops like that, and completely transforms the ownership and puts it into sort of Anglo hands for the most part. And that sets us off in this direction of how do we tame these water resources? How do we dam the rivers and channel them? But almost immediately, this flood drops out of California memory. Like, I know people who are California, grew up there, are California fanatics, who are just now learning about it. It's this thing that is quickly forgotten. But the paleo science that I was talking about earlier, it finds 5 storms in the paleo record in the last 1,000 years of greater magnitude than this flood.
Yeah.
And Daniel Swain's team at UCLA finds that a flood like this is based on atmospheric rivers and what's going on with them because of climate change. Extremely, very, very likely to happen. Like I said, more likely than not to happen over the next 30 years or so. Mm-hmm. And, it's a jaw-dropping prospect because you think the valley was fairly sparsely populated and there's documentary evidence of Native American tribes clearing out.
Yeah, they knew what to do. They knew where to go.
Yeah, they had in their oral tradition,
right.
Oh man, this isn't looking good. We have to get out of here.
Right.
But the sort of Western types didn't. But you think about how some of the fastest growing cities in California are in the Central Valley. Places like Fresno and Bakersfield are growing cities that have large populations. You got bedroom communities to the Bay Area in the Central Valley. So you got a much, much bigger population. And then you go from a kind of marginal cattle, not very intensive cattle agriculture to one of the globe's greatest agricultural behemoths. And so you're talking about knocking at least a growing season or two out of the American food system. But you're also talking about, just imagine all of the, giant dairy farms in the southern Central Valley, and imagine the logistics of trying to get hundreds of thousands of giant dairy cows
out of the way.
Out of harm's way on fairly short notice.
Yeah.
Think of all the pesticides stored down there, all the fertilizers. Think of all the oil production in places like around places like Bakersfield,
Kern County.
In Kern County. So it is a disaster of
biblical proportion.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would make the one in 162 look fairly tame, just because there's just so much more stuff there. And you guys had that sort of warning shot at the dam at Oroville a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it wasn't pretty. That attempt to evacuate wasn't pretty. Luckily, the dam held. But it's just sort of an indication of what it's going to be like. In that case, it was hundreds of thousands of people, but you could be in a situation of having to evacuate millions of people in the not too distant future. And you don't want a parking lot on highways in a situation like that.
No, you don't. And living in Sonoma County, where I've had to evacuate my home 3 times due to fires, and spending 2.5-3 hours to get from Santa Rosa to Petaluma, which is 17 miles. And it took me 3.5 hours because there was so much traffic. So, it's fear producing to think about that. And fear can freeze people. And so it's really important. The other thing in the book that you turn to after you've described all the potential scenarios, and not just scenarios, but the realities we're facing with the change in the climate and the overdrafting of water, you start talking about the solutions. One of them, obviously, is SGMA, which we've talked about, the Sustainable Groundwater Management, not agreement, but
is it Act?
Act. Thank you. And then also, which was really important because it was the first time, as you point out, California had never it was the last state in the union to actually manage groundwater in places where you need to do that. We had never done it.
Yeah.
The power of agriculture didn't want to do it really, but there have been some amazing leaders who, during the drought, I think of Craig McNamara up in Yolo County, and Miles Ryder down on the coast, and others who said, "Wait a second, if we want agriculture to be here in the long term, we have to manage groundwater." And working with Jerry Brown, they passed Sigma. Doesn't really doesn't take full effect until 2040, but I talked to a farmer yesterday who's down in Ventura County, which has actually been managing groundwater for 30, 40 years. They're way ahead of the game because they have to, because they have a lot less water. He was talking about the fact that, that it's not perfect in Ventura, but it has changed the situation, and they're basically in balance. And even though the climate's changing, they're having to update all the time. But they're not facing what's being faced in the Central Valley and the Pajaro and the Salinas valleys. So, so you do leave some hope that will have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really better. I think the only thing that, and I've been sort of, on the lookout for signs of this, and I really haven't seen it yet. Of people in various places that have lots and lots of agriculture and not much water, saying, "Hey, we've had some good winters. Why are we doing this? Why are we killing ourselves like this? And let's backtrack on it." I think the system will be gamed or attempted to be gamed, but I haven't seen a whole lot of official attacks on it. Like, why are we imposing this on ourselves? Mm-hmm. But one thing is, I have in the book, there have been a couple of pretty authoritative estimates of, what in the end the impact of Sigma will be in terms of fallowed land, mm-hmm. and the number that they came up with is substantial. If I recall correctly, it's something like 1/6 of acres in the valley will have to come out of agriculture, mm-hmm. just to create this balance, and to bring all the aquifers and basins in the balance by 2040. But I don't think those projections. I think those projections are really important, and I think they're sobering for people. But I don't think they take into account this growing body of research that says that the snowpack is going to continue to deteriorate. Mm-hmm. And I think those numbers, that 1/6, could be an underestimate. Mm-hmm. That might be a hopeful, like an overly hopeful scenario, mm-hmm. on how much agriculture can get done. And that's something that we all have to grapple with, including eaters. And people who rely on California, which is essentially the whole country, mm-hmm. Have to come to grips with. And I think there are two things here. There's how does California prepare? What is the way forward for California? And then there's the rest of the country. Yeah. And for California, I honestly don't know what the answer or what to say about this flood scenario, except for to really hope. I mean, I think we saw in Central Texas, yep. Just recently, early in 2021, about the sort of thin string that modern society hangs on. We rely on things like clean running water and electricity, and a giant flood like that would turn both of those things on their heads for lots and lots of people. And that really, really frightens me. And I don't know what the logistical answer is to that. Like, how do you prepare for something that you could make some preparations for it, but I don't see how a biblical flood of the 1861 proportions hits the area and it's not a disaster. I just can't conceive it.
I think you're right.
Hopefully someone can.
Yeah, I think, and I can hear you leaning into where you're going, but let me just say this: that I think that the thing that we learned from Texas, 2 years ago when the drought ended, I guess it was the winter 17-18, we had atmospheric rivers here, and it rained for 40 days. Now, it didn't rain.
Oh, yeah.
It didn't rain like it did back in 61, 62, 1800s, but it was monumental. My basement, I have a basement cellar. It got 2 feet of water in it. It was,
Right.
yeah, it was crazy. So I know that is feasible, possible, those kinds of events here. We've all seen it if we've lived in California. But there are two important things that you bring up. One, agriculture is going to shrink. I've heard our own Secretary of Agriculture in the state of California, Karen Ross, mention the prospects of what the industry is going to have to face as SGMA takes, because what SGMA does is it forces a balancing of aquifer recharge and utilization of that water. It has to put it back into balance. So it's going to force land to be taken out of production. You bring that up. So maybe it is 16, 18, 20, 30% of California agriculture. By the end of the century, it might be 50% of California agriculture is out of production, and we've moved to other things. But the other thing that you bring up, because the beginning, and we skipped over this, you point out how much of the nation's and the world's production food sources come out of California because of its climate and the water and all that. So you point out the need for the rest of the nation to prepare for what's coming by re-regionalizing production of fruit and vegetables around the nation. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. Obviously, this is not a new idea. I'm not the one who came up. The idea of re-regionalizing has been around for a while. Michael Pollan mentioned, talked about it a lot in his book 15 years ago now on The Worst Dilemma. Mm-hmm. But I'm coming at it here from a slightly different angle because, I think a lot of the talk about re-regionalizing originally in the 2000s was based on climate mitigation. Mm-hmm. In other words, you'd hear these food miles facts coming at you, like, the average, apple travels 1,400 miles. We have to re-regionalize that because there's big carbon footprint in getting it around. And it turns out that transporting food from California ends up being a pretty small, it really isn't the problem. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and, taking those away aren't going to make a big difference with climate change. I'm coming at it from a different angle. I'm coming at it from a climate adaptation standpoint.
Yeah.
The simple fact that, if you do the math, California can't maintain its current level of production. And, maybe currently permanent crops like almonds, pistachios are continuing as we speak to expand. And that means less ground for fruits and vegetables. And so that's another factor. And so where I come at it is we need to re-regionalize as an adaptation strategy and to build resilience into the national food system for if there is a giant flood in California that takes out the Central Valley for a growing season or 3. It's such an astounding idea that it's really hard to get scientists to speculate how long would the Central Valley be out of the game if that were to happen. Mm-hmm. Just think of all the toxins in the soil and everything. But, you're talking a couple of growing seasons, let's say. So you want to have redundancy built into the system because of that. And also because we are going to see a gradual unwinding, a gradual reining in of California agriculture as SGMA comes into play. And if we don't develop alternative supplies, then we're going to become reliant on importing fruits and vegetables, which we've already increased. And I can tell you, I did this for the book. I went around the places where the countries, the regions where we're importing the most fruits and vegetables, and all of them have situations around water and climate change that you're not going to be able to count on.
Right.
Most of the places where we get food from Mexico are just south of California or in similarly water constrained areas. Chile is a big supplier. They've got a giant drought going on there, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so I come up with this I come at it from a climate adaptation strategy that we need to build up and encourage and build on. We've had incredible work over the past 30 years. We need to build on this work of, local and regional food systems and expand them and make it official policy. Like, I don't know, I would like to see regional planners say, okay, I would like, I want us to double our output of fruits and vegetables over the next 15 years. What are the key bottlenecks preventing that from happening? Let's invest in getting over those bottlenecks. That's the kind of thing that I want to see. And it isn't, I'm not, out here, talking about food mile. I'm talking about the major source of fruits and vegetables coming under severe strain. And, most regions in the country used to grow a lot more food than they do now. And hey, this is not an easy solution. I mean, I already talked about how growing fruits and vegetables in the Northeast and Southeast is difficult because of all of the dam water, too much water. But if we face those problems and face those challenges and solve them, and there are various ways, like, you can grow in high tunnels.
Right. The Northeast does that already. A lot of people. There's a lot of great work.
Yeah, you can extend growing seasons to places like the upper Midwest and the Northeast. There's just all sorts of things that we could be doing with new appropriate technology. It's not like going back to the past. To just sort of, as I put it, de-Californified. California is always going to be a great place to grow food for reasons I already mentioned, but we're going to have to rely on it less. And I think that process has to start now.
Yeah, and the thing that I really liked about that portion of the book is that it also answers a lot of the challenges that we're seeing around the degradation of rural economies. It's another engine to bring back wealth to places that have been, basically tapped of their wealth by the corn complex and the industrial meat system. So I do think that there's corollary benefits in addition to the resilience about the food supply. There's economic rebirth potentially, or a regeneration because of what you're talking about. And so, but we're running out of time. We just have a couple of minutes left. I want to jump to one big thing. And it's because it's so controversial here with the farming community, particularly. I personally am a person that supports the idea of a new Green Deal. But you bring it up. You bring up a Green New Deal in the book, and that's kind of how you end the book. You talk about what Bernie Sanders said, what others said who were running for president in the last election, which, by the way, was incredibly exciting to have presidential candidates talking about real alternative visions for the food and agriculture system in the state of California or in the United States. It hadn't really occurred before at that level. So that was exciting to me. But there's a lot of resistance. You see the Republican Party and others kind of attacking the Green New Deal. So why don't you just talk about why you inserted that at the end of the book?
Well, so when I was writing it, Bernie Sanders was the front runner there for a minute.
Yeah.
And Liz Warren
Yep.
was a very viable candidate. And the two of them had trounced Joe Biden in Iowa. I think that had happened just before I finished that section, if I remember correctly, or at least maybe it hadn't happened yet, but they were running really strong in Iowa, and they had these really strong platforms that were, in Bernie's case, posited as a Green New Deal. In Warren's case, she may not have used that phraseology, but a similar idea. And I think what I can say about it now in 2021 with, Biden as president is that maybe that rubric isn't as relevant as it was back then, the specific naming of it. But I think there are two things that we're going to need to do, and I think they're very urgent. One of them, and both of them were goals of the Green New Deal. One of them is a very rapid drawdown, a very rapid cutting back of greenhouse gas emissions. Because, if you look at the dire predictions or dire projections in my book about California and about the Midwest,
right,
they're really based on this idea of that we're just going to keep emitting greenhouse gases. And we're going to get more than 2 degrees warming over pre-industrial levels, 2 degrees Celsius warming over pre-industrial levels. And it's going to unleash all this climate chaos that is going to be really, really bad. It's going to make the world into a place that none of us know. It's not something like we've ever experienced. We're getting the taste of it now with California fires and Texas cold snap, but that is just the prologue to the story. So I think we need to severely drop greenhouse gas emissions, and we also need to do it in a way that is fair, that is solving the inequality problem, that is bringing jobs to places like rural areas in the United States that, if you haven't noticed, have made a pretty sharp right turn in recent decades. I mean, I was looking at the electoral map of Iowa from, I think it was the 84 or the 88 presidential election. And it was almost, it was one of those county maps, and it was almost all blue. And if you look at it in 2016 or 2020, it's very, very deep red. Maybe Des Moines or a couple of other counties are different. And I think that climate chaos plus this sort of inequality that we have right now, I think there is plenty of reasonable fear about sort of right-wing populism just continuing to take hold there. And that is a twin, very ugly future. So I think we need a way to cut greenhouse gas emissions and put people to work in meaningful jobs. And I think, a lot of things like, things that are popular and necessary. I think the pandemic made clear that some kind of universal healthcare is necessary. I think all those things are going to have to happen in one way or the other. And the Green New Deal rubric tried to do that under one umbrella, but I think those goals have got to come into line. And I think it's got to happen really, really fast. And I think that, that the Democratic majority in the House and the Senate is extremely fragile heading into 2022. And I shudder to think what happens if those are lost. So I think we're just in a really tight spot. And something like the Green New Deal, and I think there's a lot in Biden's agenda, his infrastructure plans and various other plans that are getting us on the right road. And so that's what I'd say. I guess I left the book on a note of being a little bit more married to the idea of a Green New Deal specifically than I am. And I think, facts on the ground have changed. I should say there's going to be a paperback in 2022
of the
book.
I'll
get a second crack. Yeah.
Oh, good.
I'll get a second crack at writing the last chapter.
Yeah, because I was going to say anybody that, this is actually not referencing what you just said. I'll say this, that anybody that's interested in the future of agriculture needs to read the book because it makes very clear, and we didn't talk about it, the Midwest, but you do an excellent job describing the challenge around soil there. And I will say this, that despite all the attacks on the Green New Deal and the resistance that historically has come from agriculture around change, in conversations I'm having with farmers in California now, and what I'm looking happen at the federal level, at least the embracing of climate change is really emergent. That is becoming clear. The possibility of being paid to capture carbon is, in my mind, I'm down with that. As long as we stop subsidizing people to produce too much corn and soy, let's pay them to capture carbon. I'm down for that. I think that's really important. I'm glad that Zippy Duvall and the U.S. Farm Bureau is engaged in that conversation now. I'm hearing California farmers talking more and more about the impact of changes and what they need to do. Sigma's been part of that, but obviously, as you mentioned, the pandemic has been a game changer in many ways. The fragility of the system is very clear. Your book is just more detailed, beautiful evidence, good writing, and a lot of good thinking. So this has been a great conversation. I wish we had more time, but we're at the end of our time. So Tom, thank you, man, and I look forward to the paperback and see what you do with that last chapter again.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been great talking to you.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.